In this Shiur, we are continuing and concluding the topic from the previous Shiur, which is the shaila regarding Pitzua Daka, halacha l'maisa, regarding someone who had one be'er removed, with an emphasis on how this was discussed in the Kuntres Igaris Pekairis of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. And this time we get to the best part, hopefully, which is the actual part of the Kuntres, where Rabbi Yaakov Emden holds forth at great length in his inimitable style. But just to try to give a brief recap as possible, so we're discussing the shaila of Pitzua Daka. The halacha, the Torah says that Asr Lovei Bakal, he can't marry, and in fact, even if he's married, he can't be with his wife again. So based on the history we got a bit into of Sarisim through history, certainly when you speak about Pitzua Daka, the assumption is that the context is within the concept of Asaris, of being able to have children versus not being able to have children. And that's also what generally comes across from the Makairis in Chazal, but it's not fully clear. And we went through how the Mishnah words it, how the Rambam words it, how the Shulchan Aruch words it. But that essentially leads us to this question of Nital Be'a Achas. And part of the question being that as time went on, over time, the observation was made that removing one Be'a surgically doesn't necessarily seem to impact the ability to have children. So what is the din supposed to be in that scenario? As we discussed, part of what made the surgery for removing one be'ah is called an orchidectomy today. So there essentially was a form of this surgery being performed for many hundreds of years in Europe for people who had a hernia in that area. Specifically, it's called an inguinoscrotal hernia, which, by the way, I should mention, is still a fairly common phenomenon till this very day. Probably people among us have had it. Have a surgery. Obviously today the surgery does not entail that, but the actual medical problem is fairly common, and in certain places in Europe it was fairly common to treat it in this way, which necessarily for some reason required removing one. And that's a big part of the discussion from Rabbeinu Tam, who's already talking about this in Tosfos, through Rabbi Yaakov Emden. That's part of the discussion here as well. And of course, there are other cases where people were actually diseased in that area, and that also happens today, in which you have to remove it for more urgent medical reasons. And essentially the point being that we have a das yachid of the Rambam. The Rambam seemed to be more lenient for any sickness, not just being born with the problem, but even if the sickness comes on later. There's also a das yachid of Rabbeinu Tam that we just mentioned, where Rabbeinu Tam specifically talking about a healthy person who had one removed. Rabbeinu Tam says because they can have children, so therefore they're not Pitzua Daka. And that brings us to the case of the Igaris Pekairis, which, as we mentioned, was first printed by the Yaakov Emden around the time that it happened, in the end of the 1730s. And then that was essentially his first controversy, before he became more well known for many other controversies that put this one in the dust. But this is actually something that was close to his heart, and he reprinted it again in the 1760s when he was much older, and there are his sophists that he added then as well. And that whole controversy was sparked by a case where someone actually had a disease. We discussed it, the kalte brand, the cold fire, where essentially that part of the body is completely dead and needs to be removed. And the Rav of Hamburg, the Rav of Ahur, had sort of written along the lines of, there's the Rambam, which is something, and there's Rabbeinu Tam, which is something, but it's not all very simple. There's also some kind of precedent from the Shalas Tshuvas Tumas Yesharim, where they seem to be makel somewhat in a case leave his marriage. But we should warn the couple that they are essentially playing around with the Isser of Pitzua Daka and leave it up to them. And then this Reb Shimshon Chassid, who was a big Talmud Chacham in Hamburg, who was the head of the... So he responded, and he seems to be, in terms of when you think of this in terms of being a more contemporary question, thinking of it in a contemporary way, how do we resolve the halacha with the medicine, with the science? So he really takes what the doctors say and puts it front and center and quotes from them at length about how it's absolutely possible to have children. And he just goes on the record and says that we need to bring the sugya in line with the Metzias, and I that Ashba said when it comes to Treifis, that we just leave the categories of Chazal in place and we don't ask questions about whether, no. He says, okay, that's just what the Ashba said about Treifis, but otherwise, in every other case, let's try to get the halacha to fit what makes sense. But he also derails the conversation a bit and takes it into the topic of this these surgery. And this person they got married and they had kids. He's trying to use that as proof. And that's his whole task. He's making a big deal out of it and heading in that is worth essentially of Rabbi Yaakov Emden in the next half an hour or so. I say 70 pages because the edition that I'm using is a new edition of She'elas Yavitz, which are Shalos Tshuvos, and they included in Chelik Gimel, towards the end of Chelik Gimel, they also included the whole Igeres B'Keiros, which they retyped. The one chesaron I would note is that since essentially he printed it twice, they really should have pointed out where there are shinuyim or hisafis in the second print versus the first print. It seems like they just went with the second print and did not comment at all, so that's chaval. And Rabbi Yaakov Emden goes completely in the opposite direction and to a very great extreme, which is perhaps not surprising. So we have a lot of questions, a lot of fundamental questions here. What's the din l'maisa? How do we go about paskening this? How much should we take the mitzias into account? And what's just the traditional way of viewing this question? Are we trying to be machmir? It's like an ashes, is it like an aguna type of situation? Are we looking at it that way? Are we looking at it as a mamzer situation? There's different ways sort of attitudes that we bring to different types of shilas. What's the attitude that we're even applying here? Obviously, Rav Shimshon Bloch has his attitude. Yaakov Emden clearly has a different one. And we'll essentially see why he's getting so worked up, because to him this is outrageous. And I'm not even sure if we'll be able to get to all the points that I think are notable. We're just going to have to see how much we get to here, and then we're going to have to conclude with where the halacha went from there after that discussion. Okay. Here we go. So there are essentially three parts of Yaakov Emden's tshuva. The first is what he says is the tshuva he wrote when he was first presented with the question before he saw what others wrote. Maybe he just saw what the Rav wrote, but not what Rav Shimshon Bloch wrote. Then there are two responses to Rav Shimshon Bloch. One is to his hasagas. He had written hasagas on the Rav's tshuva, and then Rav Shimshon's lengthy tshuva of his own, which Yaakov Emden responds to at the greatest length. So let's just try to go through each of them and get the main points. So Yaakov Emden begins by restating the question. He says he was asked the question as well. This person with the Kal Tibran, they removed it. So he says, really, this is a tough question. I would want to get too deeply into this, and it's a tough question either way, no matter what you answer. And by the way, of course, we have a very chashuv Rav who already said his piece. Then in parentheses, and this is something that he essentially added, I checked, this is something he added in the second edition. Yaakov Emden didn't actually like the Rav of Hamburg very much. So in the first edition, Rav was still alive, and he was, I guess, still trying to get along. So he says, the Rav already said what he had to say. In the second edition, he adds in parentheses, by the way, I didn't actually mean what I said. I actually didn't respect the Rav at all, but that's what I had to say. So, that's, classic Yaakov Emden. He starts getting into some of you have Rabbeinu Tam, you have the Rambam, and he's going to start arguing that certainly the Rambam especially is not someone that we should be building much on. So let's see. He says Rabbeinu Tam. Says first of all, Rabbeinu Tam is a yachid, das yachid. Everyone's against Rabbeinu. It's Rabbeinu Tam against everybody. So why would we go with Rabbeinu Tam? Okay, so that's like, he has a whole presentation how he explains why. Vasepis, you would just go with Rabbeinu Tam, and the Ramah, look at the Ramah, it says not to follow Rabbeinu Tam, etc., etc. Then he switches to the Rambam, and says, the Rambam, Baiter, everyone disagrees with the Rambam. Along the way, he has an interesting point about the bidei shema, these terms, bidei shemayim, bidei adam, right? So part of this discussion is essentially, what is the definition of the terms bidei shemayim, bidei adam? Isn't illness bidei shemayim? Why is the Rambam the only one who's saying that illness counts as bidei shemayim and everyone is disagreeing with the Rambam? isn't illness bidei shemayim? So he says this is the kind of thing in Chazal where some of these terminology, some of these terms are very slippery, and depends how you look at it. So he says, L'mashal, we say tzinem upachim bidei adam. So right, certain illnesses are bidei shemayim, certain illnesses are bidei adam, and in each case it's really a combination. To some extent it's your fault. To some extent it's still coming from somewhere else. So he wants to make the case that the true definition here, b'dei shemayim b'dei adam, is b'dei shemayim truly means that a person was born that way, and that they never had a shas hakosher. And he says that the Riyaz and Shilti Gibayrim phrases it this way, he says, the Riyaz, he got it right. The one thing he's willing to acknowledge is that sometimes a person appears to have one, but he really has a second one that's hidden somewhere. And he says, and this is the kind of thing where I've researched. I had incidents that came up, and I researched, and I found out that they appear to have one, but they really have two, because really the second one never descended, or whatever the term is. So he wants to say that everyone disagrees with the Ram is mamash adas yachid, and also the way he's understanding all the sugyas, like he's mamash trying to isolate the Rambam to a tremendous extent. But at any rate, part of the issue here is that the Rambam is talking about, at least there's parts of the Rambam, there were terms in the Rambam, words in the Rambam that are debated. But the most consensus reading of the Rambam is that mamish happened on its own. The question here is, what if the guy had Kal Tibran, so essentially that part of his body was already dead, and now the doctors just removed it. So is that, according to the Rambam, that when it was dead, it was bidei shemayim. So now the doctors removed it. Is that still bidei shemayim because it was already dead, or is it bidei adam in the sense that now they actually physically removed it? So now it's more of a bidei adam type of thing. That's part of the question here. So he goes off into this bit of a rant. The doctors said that it was completely dead and there was nothing you could do. But he says, should we really trust the doctors? So this is part of his whole attitude that he's displaying throughout this whole discussion. Is, how often the doctors disagree. This doctor says it's completely terminal. The other doctor says lav dafka. And you're going to start deciding Yisurim Shel Torah based on what this doctor says, but that doctor says no. And then he goes even further. He wants to argue that the Rambam never said, meaning not only is the Rambam not talking about in a case where some wanted to argue, as part of his case, he makes the argument that in this way, the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, he says, even if you will argue that it's not necessarily the Pshat in the Rambam, but certainly we should be Malamed Schus in the Rambam. Everything makes a lot more sense that way. That is his presentation. So then everyone agrees to everything, and then there's no machlekes, so then there would mamish be no basis for saying any of this. Interestingly, after all of that, he gets back to Rabbeinu Tam, he says, even though the Chatchilu, we don't paskin like Rabbeinu Tam, but if you were, so dafka not in this case of an illness, but in the case of the hernia surgery, he says, if someone were to paskin like Rabbeinu Tam, I wouldn't be so upset about it. Because there's a musig of the Barda Asra, he's the Paisik, Rabbeinu Tam is the Paisik of Ashkenaz. He gives other examples that there was a certain shtickle chaylev, that Bnei Reinus used to eat the shtickle chaylev. And they're being soymech be'isr kares al divrei yachid, Rabbeinu Yoel neged kol chachmei Yisrael, just like you have instances of this in Chazal. So he says, Ashkenaz, Sarfas, they're all the Asrei, they're my Rabbeinu Tam, they're Paskin Lefi Rabbeinu Tam. So if someone's going to be Mekel in a pure, actual case that Rabbeinu Tam was talking about, then I could accept that. But that's not what we're talking about here. The original case that we were discussing here was the case of a chayli. And Rabbeinu Tam clearly said that he only says what he says when it was gezunt, and they removed the Bashenkin when there was illness, and then it was removed. Even Rabbeinu Tam says clearly that that's how he makes the sugya make sense. The Mishnah says nittel. So he says only nittel if it was, there was already an illness. So, and in that sense also, he repeats throughout that Rabbeinu Tam and the Rambam are essentially punkt verkehrt. Rabbeinu Tam's shita only works when you're healthy, the Rambam shita only works when you're ill. So you certainly can be mitzaref those two things. This is what about if it was up to me and I was being machmir? What would I actually say? What are we proposing? What should happen in this case? You're asking me whether he should be peirush miyashtay. I would ask even further: does he have to be megadash ishtay? Because when there are other isurim, when other marriages are done be'isur, generally the standard is that we are b'kayfel ha'itzi. He says, Could be in this case, we wouldn't have to say that. Could be in this case, we can make an arrangement where they're Eidim, whether they can keep their marriage alive, functional to some extent without him being Peirush from her and whatever requirements you'd have to have in place to avoid the actual Gedushin. Especially here, where in all the other cases of Arayas, the marriage itself should never have happened. So we're upset about that. We're trying to undo it. Here, we're talking about someone who got married, didn't have any problem, nothing wrong with him, and then he has the problem. So, Lav Dafka, we're going to be as tough on him. Lav Dafka, we're going to try to force him to be Moitzi. And it's not like in a regular case, the person can have children, so then the fact that he's in a marriage where he can't have children, that's enough as a privative. We have to get him out of this marriage. Here, he can't have children. So why do we care if he remains in a marriage like this? And then he says, anyway, in this case in particular, based on what I've heard about this guy's medical case, it didn't help. After they removed whatever they removed, if someone's body reached that point where there was kal to brand, where parts of his body were mamish completely beyond repair, so he's clearly not doing too well to begin with. Even after they removed it, he was still essentially dying. So you can leave the guy alone, leave the poor guy alone. And then he goes off into an interesting sikkum as to all the terminology, because part of this confusion here in Chazal, there are a lot of terms, what's bidei shemayim, what's bidei adam, what's this, what's a saris even. Chazal use saris in interesting ways. Right, I was making the case last week that essentially a pitzuadaka is a subcategory of a saris. A saris is anybody who can't have children, and a pitzuadaka is a subcategory of that, but that's not how Chazal seem to use the terms. They refer to specific people as a siris chama, a siris adam. They're not really calling a pitzuadaka a saris. So he actually has this very interesting attempt to make a Greisa Seder in Chazal, that there's bidei shemayim, there's bidei adam, there's a saris, each one has 3 efanim, but I guess we're going to be bekatzer. So that was essentially the thrust of how he wrote his tshuva, supposedly initially before he even saw what others said, especially his nemesis. So therefore, he ends off saying, look, I'm not paskening, I'm proposing, I'm sharing my thoughts. Then there's some text that appears after that in which he says, a bit odd, unless I'm misunderstanding, but he seems to say that then both sides came to me. There was internal drama and politics, and both sides came running to me. Each one wanted to recruit me to their side in this halachic drama. And I ended up, he says, Chasamti achar divrei hamakilin. I ended up signing on to those who were makel. And I wrote it in a certain way, and they didn't chap that I really didn't agree with them. It's hard to understand exactly what the circumstances were and what the motivations were and what exactly is going on there. It seems like there might have been other considerations, social, political. So on the one hand, he seems to be going along and agreeing, but then when they actually went ahead and also ma'aseh lahakol b'isur deraisa, so then all of a sudden he felt like he blew up. So a bit unclear about that, but also maybe not so surprising. Next comes the next tshuva that are hasagas on the Shimshon. Here's where you start seeing his irritation growing. And perhaps that's what changed. Maybe once he saw how the Mekilim made the argument, it bothered him more and disturbed him. So he begins by saying he's going to get into it, and he throws a few barbs at this Shimshon Chassid. He was known as the Chassid, meaning he was extra pious. Back before Baal Shem Tov and Chassidim, Chassid was a term used in many communities for people that were more parish minat zibur and were pursuing spirituality or whatever. So this person had a reputation. They called him the Chassid, so he's throwing comments in that direction. And part of his argument, like I mentioned already before, part of it is that there's some kind of contradiction here. You can't go with the Rambam and Rabbeinu Tam. For the Rambam to work, you have to make the case that it was so diseased, it was so beyond hope, that it was mamish b'dei shemayim. That what the doctors did is just removing something that's already dead b'dei shemayim. In order for Rabbeinu Tam to work, it's literally the opposite. You have to make the case that it was in ganzen gesund, and they removed the gesunte beya, and that's Rabbeinu Tam shitta. So he says Shimshon is almost like flip-flopping. When he talks about the Rambam, he says, yeah, it was good according to the Rambam. When he speaks about Rabbeinu Tam, he says, yeah, it was good according to Rabbeinu Tam. You can't have both. Which one is it? Already touches here a bit on the question of what's the Metzias? first of all, what's the halachas? B'tzua daka based on being able to have children or not? And second of all, what's the metzias? Are there cases where people with one are having children? He says, no, lav dafka. Just like you see, it says Pitsua b'dei shamayim is kosher, right? Everyone agrees that there's some case in which if it's mamish b'dei shamayim, we're talking about both. If it's mamish b'dei shamayim, then he is mutar lav bakol. So you see there are instances in which a person is a Pitsua daka, and yet, Gzeir is hakasav, that the Gzeir only applies in that scenario, not in that scenario. So it could be, gar zayin, it could be fakir as well. Maybe there are cases in which a person is yachal ha'ilid, and still he has a din Pitsua daka. Why did you decide that mamish has to follow the metzias? He gets very upset when Rav Shimshon says that what's going on over here? You have to be very sensitive to what you're doing. It could be a get mu'usa. He says, no, what are you talking about? If it's taka correct, that they're not allowed, if it's mamash allowed, then no get mu'usa. What are you talking like any other isser? It's essentially a lot of the things Rav Shimshon are saying are triggering him, even though in his first tshuva himself, he seemed a little bit more open perhaps to some of these gedanken. He has this whole speech about how Rabbeinu Tam is a yachid, and even though there are other Yishayim that quote Rabbeinu Tam, doesn't make a difference, doesn't mean anything. Just because Yishayim quote other Yishayim doesn't matter. I think that's most people would not agree with his argument, but that's part of what he has to say in order to make Rabbeinu Tam mamish a yachid. Then he gets upset that Shimshon said that, I don't understand why the Rav is giving a hard time. The Rav said he wants to get other opinions from other Rabbanim. Shimshon said, all the opinions that you need are already there. You have the Shas Tshuvas Tumas Yesharim. And Yaakov Emden goes off into this whole thing about, I don't understand, why are you so quick to paskin? This is completely inappropriate. A whole arichas on that. Then he goes off and tells the reader that Bechlal, you can't rely on Sfarim, you have to go through the sugya yourself. You can't just rely on how a sefer presents it, which I guess is, that's always a good point to keep in mind. Then towards this, he says, by the way, sometimes you have a whole discussion in halacha, and someone says, what happened in the end? What was the end of the story? Right? What happened to this? So he says, the end of the story, by the way, is that the person passed away in the end. It was terminal illness, and it spread, and it kept on spreading, and he died. So the whole shaila, the whole controversy is not even very negea. The guy died within a short period of time, it seems. But the fight still carried on. Okay, now we're up to his longest part, which we're going to have to skim even more. And here's where he also sounds as angry. This is where he's responding to Shimshon's full tshuva. He has part of the joy of reading Yaakov Emden is all his asides, all the things he mentions b'derech agav. At one point along the way, he gets into how we factor in the Yerushalmi to the sugya. What status does the Yerushalmi have? And he makes this strong case. No, Adarabah, the Yerushalmi is very helpful in clarifying sugyas that are unclear in the Bavli. And in fact, the Paiskim even quote from the Tosefta when necessary. And then he goes even further and says, there even you see mechabrim that quote from Sfarim Chitzonim, mamish Sfarim that are beyond the canon, wherever Chazal are not clear. And that's why on the one hand Chazal say you're not supposed to read it, but on the other hand Chazal use it. And he starts quoting examples from Zohar. And in Zohar it quotes the Sefer of Ashmedai and the Sefer of this Malach, Sefer of Ashmedai. So he says, you see that we're willing to quote Svarim even like that, which is interesting to hear from Yaakov Emden. And that's the way Torah works. Okay, just an interesting aside. Back a bit to the doctors. Well, the question is, Yaakov Emden is kind of dancing around a bit the question. What's the metzias of these people? What's going on here? So he says, these dogs, he says, Shimshon has this whole arichas about the doctors. The doctors say that, they could totally have children. And they say, once you remove one, then you have double the strength in the second. And the Shimshon even tried bringing a raya from a Gemara somewhere. But he says, even if the doctors are right, your raya from the Gemara is ridiculous. I'm not going to go off into that. But anyway, he says, of course you can't trust that. You trust these doctors. And especially the argument, he gets very hung up on the idea that he said that the second one doubles in strength. Does that make any sense? If you have two limbs, if you have two arms, you lose one chas v'shalom. So does one arm double in strength? If a person's blind, loses one eye, chas v'shalom, does the other eye double in strength? Okay, happens to be that technically, whether or not that's true, first of all, every limb could be different, and sometimes we do know that when someone is disabled, they can have more strength in other limbs, so who knows, it's probably not so straightforward. But at any rate, it doesn't really matter whether or not. We saw from the studies that they did a few decades ago, that part is not true. It doesn't double in strength. The person's kayach, maybe taka, is cut in half. So what? That doesn't actually change the question. The question is if they can still have children, what's the story? But anyway, that's what Yaakov Emden gets hung up on. Goes off into the eyes, and how back then they hadn't fully articulated how the two eyes work together, but he says clearly you have this idea where the two eyes work in tandem. He expresses it in probably in terminology that isn't correct today. He said, anyway, if you believe these doctors, again, Rabbi Tam said that the only time Rabbi Tam holds what he holds, only when you removed it from a healthy person. But if it was already harmed, if it was already messed up in some way, so then even Rabbi Tam is made. It says, no, the doctors, they go further than Rabbi Tam. The doctors say you can remove one no matter what, whether it was healthy, whether it wasn't healthy. So are we going all the way with the doctors? So in a chanami, that's Taka Yaakov Emden is making a good point in terms of Rabbi Tam's shitta, but in terms of what we know today, seemingly, in Taka, yeah, it's also Kasha and Rabbi Tam. Rabbi Tam went some part of the way, but we know seemingly that it might not matter, or depends what is going on there, of course. So I'm observing certain parts in Yaakov Emden's argument that might have holes in them from our perspective. Then he gets to the part with the Rashba. The Rashba said that we follow Chazal, and he said, but that's just there, and everywhere else we should try to bring Chazal in line. He says, how dare you? This is where he really gets worked up. How dare you say this? And he says, this person is known as Shimshon Chassid. He's known as this very derheben mensch. If I didn't know who it was, if I didn't know that it was this Ish Chassid Lamdan Bal Amunah, I would think it's one of the Kaifrim that wrote something like this. How can someone say such a thing? And then he goes off into this whole thing about how old-fashioned medicine and ancient medicine, they were on the right track. They understood how, there's actually, interestingly, there's something from the Alter Rebbe along these lines, that even though it looks like they're making a lot of progress, but the progress is just sort of focusing on particular details. But the Malga Chachamim, they had the big picture, they understood things on a deeper level. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden is making a similar argument. So he's very upset at this whole notion that the doctors today would even have anything valuable to add, to contribute to this discussion. Again, Lamaisa coming now, obviously, it's not so straightforward. It's Yaakov Emden is obviously, we can see where he's coming from, and it's very admirable, but as we know, these questions of Torah and Reifim are more complicated than that. So he just says he's willing to say that we could just throw them all out the door, and all these paiskim, in other cases where they believe what doctors say about nida, and this is something I spoke about at the beginning of last year, about trusting doctors when it comes to fasting and Yom Kippur, when it comes to nida, when it comes to vaccines. So this is something Yaakov Emden goes on the record and says, yeah, I'm very turned off by all these paiskim that are quoting doctors in cases of nida where they're trying to find a heter, and the doctor says, oh no, that's not dam nida, that's something else. Why are you believing in them? Then he goes off into this whole thing about how people are being paid to paskin, which is very interesting. Not clear what the context is, but apparently, I guess, in very extreme situations, maybe sometimes when paiskim wrote heterim, they were commissioned to write the heter, and that's something that he calls out. And then at some point he starts directly denying the Metzias in this case. He says, in this case, how do we know? Yeah, they had children, says who? What, did someone watch the woman the whole time to make sure that she didn't do anything wrong? We should believe Chazal, we should believe even the ancient doctors, ancient medicine. Rambam didn't agree with Rabbi Tam. Rambam is a bigger doctor than Rabbi Tam. Rabbi Tam says they're moiled. The Rambam is a doctor. If they were moiled, he should have said so. He didn't say so. So he's willing to reject Rabbi Tam, reject the doctors. No, they're not moiled. And then again he says, and anyway, even if he would be mammon that this milet, that he could be milet, could be that the categories in halacha don't overlap beautifully with Metzias. Could be there's some cases in which you can't be moiled and you're mutter lo bakal, and some cases in which you can be moiled and you would be aser lo bakal. Part of the way how he makes that argument, though, is his assumption would be that maybe only a miyut of those who have one removed would be able to be moiled. The fact that we know today that seemingly almost 100% of people that have one removed can be moiled would make it a little harder, seemingly, to make that argument. He goes and he comes up with this whole theory about how the treifus. What's the word with treifus? Why do the treifus? Why does the Metzias seem to be different than the halacha? The word is that there's always exceptions. He says once you have this yesod, then everything in Chazal makes sense. There are always going to be exceptions. Sometimes Chazal mention the exceptions. Dafka when Chazal mentions strange things, that's also Chazal are mentioning the unusual exception to teva. And when Chazal don't mention it, but you should still assume that even if Chazal state a rule as a blanket statement, you should assume, you'll probably come across exceptions to that. And he presents this whole theory about how teva is not fixed, and it ties into the discussion of nishtanu hativim, which is something that poskim use, which is its own question, its own sugya that needs to be understood. So he wants to make this argument that teva is always slipping a little bit. There are always cracks, and there are always going to be unusual exceptions. And here's where we mentioned last week that on the Shiur blot, it's a kuntres about the Saris Tzodaka. On the Shiur blot, he says, by the way, I'm going to tell you a story about a Basula who conceived without, if he felt the Sarayin. So this is the connection. He's trying to say that, this theory that he's come up with about how there's the Kolel and Teva and Chazal are the ones who set those Kolel, and then there could be exceptions, whether mentioned by Chazal or not mentioned by Chazal. So he starts listing all these random things he read in the newspaper. He says clearly that he read it, Chidushim Zarim Ma'oid Bepiskos Hanitpasa Midei Shavua B'Shavua. So he used to get the paper, and he apparently had a koch and reading the weird facts, the odd news. So he says that one thing I read was that in Peru is in the news right now. In Peru, they found a guy who's 140 years old and he has 800 descendants. Read that. So you see, interesting things happen. Another example is, they say in Sweden, a girl didn't eat for 4 months. He says, I didn't actually fully trust. Maybe I shouldn't trust what the paper says. But then there was another one that there was an animal somewhere where the zachar suddenly was nursing. So that's something which Chazal do mention. Adam shniftachol eidadim kedad isha. Says just now there's an isle near America that was transferred to British control, and there's some kind of plant there that has some life to it. I don't know if he's talking about like the Venus flytrap or something. Don't know. It'll be interesting to track down every particular vart. That's not what we have time for. He says there was a black woman who suddenly her skin turned white. He's quoting all kinds of very interesting stuff, without which it wouldn't be a proper kuntres by Rabbi Yaakov Emden. And then he gets to this thing from the Shiur blot, that there are different cases where there was a case in France where a girl became pregnant and she still had her basulin, and then there are even more. He says there are sources that say, he read in some book, that there's a place where women conceive from eating grapes, and that's so in his framework, the way he's understanding the world, like I said, is that there's rules of Teva, but there are always going to be unusual exceptions. And on the one hand, all the strange things that Chazal say, or all the strange things that you read in the paper, they could all be true. It's not a stira. And also the Kolel and Chazal say, even when there seem to be exceptions, no, there are always exceptions. You don't have to make a big deal out of it. But back to our topic. He wants to say, let's not play games with Chazal. Chazal say they're not moiled, they're probably not moiled, maybe there are exceptions, that's not going to change the psak. And then he says, the fact that Reb Shimshon named names, and said this one, that one, he says, I'd be embarrassed of doing that if I were you. You're telling me people whose children I should now write, okay, I don't believe his children are taka his anymore. That's not the information you should have printed. So that's his response to that. Again, obviously, as we know now in hindsight, could be Could be when you're removed, when you do an orchidectomy, it could be that surgery is amol, depends how well you do the surgery. It could be the likelihood of messing things up and preventing them from having children could have been higher back then. Could be there was a lower rate. But the way it sounds today, under proper conditions, it seems that typically people can still have children. So Yaakov Emden's argument is interesting and convincing in certain parts, but his Taichin Rambam is not really accepted, and his argument about the Metzias isn't really satisfactory in terms of what we know today. So just to give some perspective on where the discussion has gone from there, so the big source would be Rabbi Yosef. In Shut Rabbi Yomer Chelek Zayin, Even Ezer Siman Ches, there is this very, very lengthy tshuva, a tour de force, like Rabbi Yosef is known to do, where he really plows through the sugya and quotes probably every single mucker in existence. So we don't have that one. We're basically at the end of our time here. Give me another 2 minutes, please. So in Tafshin Mem Zayin, he was asked about someone who was not religious, and he was living bepritzus, and apparently he caught some kind of disease from some kind of venereal disease that affected that part of his body, and at some point they had no choice, they removed one. But he demanded, they gave him a certificate that says that he's still able to reproduce, and he lived with other women afterwards, and he certainly had Kayach Gavra, that's for sure. And 4 years ago he became from, and now he wants to know, is he mutter lavi bakal? So there's a tshuva from Rabbi Yosef here that's how many Aisias? Chaf Ais, 20 Aisias. Obviously we're not going to be able to go through even a fraction of that. But he goes through, and the big marker that none of these Makaidas mention is the Marshal. The Marshal says perhaps the most interesting thing. The Marshal says that perhaps the way the doctors do it today is different. That could be Chazal we're talking about late the Metzias, that there was no way to do it in a way where a person's left with one and can still have children. But now the doctors have worked out a new Metzias. So I don't know how far the Marshal himself meant that, but the way various achreidim that Rabbi Yosef quotes, the way Rabbi Yosef himself uses it, is to say that we're not like saying that the halacha has been found to be wrong, or that we have to change the halacha. In Gans and Anayim, there's all different mitzias. The Mishnah and the Rambam and the Shraga are talking about Stam, the ultimate mitzias. And now, in light of what the doctors are able to do today, it's like they're doing a different thing, and that different thing is not a Petsuah Daka. And that essentially is, I guess, the most convincing argument you could make that would make it feel satisfactory and that we somehow have resolved all these Makaidas. And of course he just quotes a very long list of Achreinim who essentially did paskin one after the other after Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Most of them don't quote Igaris Makaidas. It wasn't that even that influential on the whole discussion. But some do. They quote the Knesset Yecheskel. And you see a large number of Achreinim that are saying, the Aruch HaShulchan, which is, he codifies this, he writes, obviously that surgery, the orchidectomy for hernia, is obviously ended at some point, and the real question that we're left with is, in a case of chayli, so you go with the Rambam, and etc. Okay, and there are some other interesting makayos. There's a Teiras Chesed, there's a Tzemach Tzedek. Rabbi Yosef himself has the extra challenge that he always likes to follow the Mechaber. The Mechaber didn't really seem to be leaving that much room to be Mekel, so by introducing the Marshal, he does his Sfek Sveikus, maybe Allah Chazak Neram, maybe Allah Chazak Ben Tam, this, that, but by using the Marshal, that seems to be a very powerful argument for him that we're talking about a different Mitzvah, then we're fine. Lamaisa, he says, Maskana Dedina, that he was matter this person. And even though in this case, it's even b'dei shemayim, it's an illness, the way the Rambam is usually understood, but in this case the guy was also a parutz, and he sort of caught a disease from his behavior, but no, it doesn't really change it, it's still considered b'dei shemayim, which gets into that discussion that Yaakov Emden mentioned, what's the line between b'dei shemayim and b'dei adam is actually not as clear necessarily as you might think, but la'alacha l'maisa, he was matur lisa bas Yisrael, in line with what seems like mostly a consensus of the Achreinim of the last 300 years, and then he says, this was in Tafshin Mem Zayin, addressed to a Rav, he says, when he printed it, he adds, Achar Shonim Rabbis, I heard from that Rav, the Rav of Kiryat Shmona, that based on the heter, he got married, Ukvar Nerdulam, Shnei Bonim, but Tazreini Simcha. I was very happy to hear that, and with that, we conclude. Good Shabbos.